I am currently a second and third grade teacher at Urban Discovery Academy Charter School in San Diego. And at the time of this inquiry, I was a first and second grade combo teacher at that same school, Urban Discovery Academy. Before I begin the induction presentation, I wanted to give a brief background on my class, as I feel it was significant to the induction process itself. I started off the 2021-2022 school year as a second grade primary teacher at Urban Discovery. However, due to some unforeseen staff complications, we had to switch up um, how first and second grade was organized. So all first and second grade teachers ended up switching positions. I ended up becoming a first and second grade combo math teacher. Um, this made my position a little bit different because I still had a primary classroom of students, about 24 students, but I also had 75 students total where I would switch throughout the day to teach them math. For this inquiry itself, I'm going to be focusing on only the 24 students that I had in my primary first to second grade combo class. It also should be noted that at the beginning of the inquiry, I had a focus student that was different from the one I had now. My previous focus student was more based on behavior concerns rather than academic concerns. Um, but in the middle of the inquiry, I switched to this student who had more academic difficulties, a first grader that tested very low in reading comprehension and reading skill, and showed very poor number sense in mathematics. I chose her primarily due to the poor number sense and how behind she was in academics altogether. My professional growth goal for this inquiry and throughout the entire school year was based on formative assessments to better help my small groups. I felt that at the beginning of the inquiry, my small group instruction was poor, to say the least, or at the very least, unorganized. So my growth goal at the beginning of this induction was to use assessments such as exit tickets, Kahoots, and just observational data throughout the week on all of my students to gather data and to look at trends in their improvement and to use that data and observation from the assessments to create small group intervention plans for the students and for the families to report back to them. I wrote that I hope to use these exit tickets to better organize and differentiate my small heterogeneous groups, as I felt currently they were too broad, basically meaning that they weren't divided enough to help each group of students. So for this course, it'll be specifically for math, just because I could not do ELA due to my position at the time, and basing my small groups off of the formative assessments that I collect throughout the week. My inquiry question was, how can I use formative assessments such as exit tickets, various games, and observational data to guide my instruction and differentiate small groups? So my overall growth goal and question for the inquiry was based on formative assessments to better help my small group instruction. Now, because I couldn't do an ELA lesson, which I did want to do beginning of my inquiry to help out my CalTPA 2, because I couldn't do that due to my math position, I was kind of forced to go with a math lesson, which I used throughout this inquiry, which I don't think was super common, but I used. So the lesson that I focused on involves students, first and second, being able to tell time in hour, half hour, and 5-minute increments. Now, prior to the inquiry process beginning, my class had done a small dive into telling time, about a week's worth of lessons. The lessons involved videos on telling time, whole group instruction, small group instruction. Again, not a big fan of my small group lessons at that time, but I still did them a couple times a week, and online activities to support them. Online games through Seesaw and Zern that involved telling time that I thought was helping them at the time. Here were a few things that I tried before the inquiry really got started. This will be for my first assessment data collection. I was using manipulatives at the time, a form of formative assessment. I had these tiny yellow clocks. They're little toys that the kids could use to show time on the clockboard. They would hold them up for me in small group, and they'd be able to get a chance to just hold an actual clock in their hands, which I felt would help them get the time lesson down faster. Um, we also used whiteboards as a formative assessment. So during whole group instruction, I would have a clock that I would put a time on, and they would write down what the time was on the whiteboard and then show the whole class and myself, so that way I would know which students were following along and which students were extremely lost. I found that really useful um, during the inquiry and just during classes altogether. And finally, the main thing that I used for assessment at this time, my data collection, was an 18-point exit ticket. You can kind of see right here. This exit ticket had half hour, hour, and 5-minute increments on it. And the student's job was to be able to read the clock and write down the correct digital time on the page. These are my first student scores after about 2 weeks into the inquiry when we did our first data collection. The majority of second graders received a passing score of 75% or higher, but most of my first grade students did not receive that passing score. And my focus student, unfortunately, was only able to get one question correct. So you can see here, 1 out of 18, 1 out of 18 points correct, unfortunately. So I knew that in my research, I'd have to find different ways to improve their scores and improve my small group instruction to better help my students. So during the literature review on the inquiry, I found two techniques that I wanted to implement. The 3-act task, which is basically sort of a small group way of presenting a problem. So it starts with presenting the problem and engaging in perplexing act. And then the second step involved the students coming up with an information and a solution seeking act. And the final act was a solution discussion where they discuss why it's the correct answer, what was the correct answer, and how they immediately knew what the correct answer was. The second strategy I used was the 5 math process, which again was a set of steps: predict, observe, select, order, and connect. Um, these techniques were similar in that they both involved discussion from my students. And even for first and second grade, I found it very useful because we could use these to kind of frame the small group um, and what the kids are telling you step by step, predicting what the time is, observing on the clock, what's showing that, um, and why. I found it very useful. And as you can see on my next step, there was significant growth because of these techniques added in both first and second grade. Um, in second grade, there was only one student who did not receive a passing score of 75% or higher. Um, and for my first grade students, there's significant growth as well, with the majority of the class receiving 75% or higher. My focus student also showed significant growth as well on a very similar assessment. Um, Unfortunately, my focus student throughout my inquiry was absent a lot of the time, so I did not get to pull her as much as I would have wanted to for small group, but I still found significant growth in the assessment, which is very good. This assessment, by the way, was a very similar um, assessment page to the one here, the exit ticket, only this one happened to be 16 questions as opposed to the 18. Now, after the inquiry, I had a lot of reflection. I felt that I myself really improved and matured in my teaching ability, um, and I was able to use research a lot better and a lot wiser than I had in the past. The advice of my mentor and the experience I gained from the inquiry process and the assignments was extremely helpful, especially in helping me try out new formative assessments to help my small groups. Um, and because of the inquiry process, I became familiar with a bunch of different strategies that I'm still using to this day, like the 3-act task and the 5 math process. My overall inquiry reflection is that I feel significantly more successful in teaching, especially in math. And I felt, especially the last half of the inquiry went very well. I implemented a lot more small group instruction towards the end. Applied the 2 strategies that I learned, the 3-act task and the 5 math process. Um, and before I did these things, there were large gaps in student growth in my first and second graders. They were receiving low scores, and after this inquiry, they received much higher scores and seemed to enjoy small group instruction a lot more, and it seemed a lot more useful for them. So I saw a lot of growth in that. And now this year, after this inquiry, I use small groups way more often, and I find it way more useful. As my final thoughts for induction, easily the best part of induction was the work and advice that I completed with my mentor. I was very fortunate in that my mentor was someone who was on site with me every day. I didn't see her every day necessarily, but she was always available for help. And she was also someone who knew how my school worked and had experience with my students before. So her advice and techniques proved to be invaluable. Um, Induction forced me to do a lot of research on my own that I found very useful, and I wish I had more time to do throughout teaching. But as we know, teaching can be pretty busy, and there's not always time to research. Um, but everything that I learned in induction and that I practiced, I found extremely essential. And I'm looking forward to year 2. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.